There's a largely unspoken rule in the Australian automotive industry, a sort of grim acceptance that exists between the manufacturers and the public. It's the understanding that Australia is the killing fields of the car world. A massive continent with a tiny population, geographically isolated at the bottom of the world, with a consumer base that's historically cynical, brand loyal to a fault, and utterly ruthless when they smell a rat. Brands like Daihatsu, Seat, and Daewoo have all washed up on Australian shores, struggled for air, and eventually drowned. But usually, that death is a slow, agonizing process. It takes years of declining sales and restructuring before the final going out of business sign goes up. But in 2012, Opel, the German subsidiary of the colossal General Motors empire, decided they didn't have time for a slow death. The timeline of Opel Australia is so compressed it almost sounds like fiction. In August 2012, they launched with the pomp and ceremony of a royal wedding. They hired staff, flew executives from Germany, spent tens of millions of dollars on television advertising, and convinced 20 independent Australian business families to pour their life savings into building brand new showrooms. And then, just a year later, they were gone. The entire operation simply evaporated. To put that timeline into perspective, if a child was born on the night of the Opel launch party in Sydney, that baby wouldn't even be walking yet by the time the company had liquidated its assets, fired its staff, and boarded the first plane back to Frankfurt. But to call it a failure is almost too polite. To the dealers who lost millions and the customers who were left with orphaned cars, it felt like a heist. So how does a company with the engineering might of Germany and the financial backing of General Motors manage to misread an entire continent so spectacularly? How do you take a product that Australians actually liked and turn it into a toxic asset in less than 12 months? To pull off a launch of this scale, Opel had to constantly fly their executives the grueling 22 hours from their headquarters in Frankfurt all the way down to Sydney. And honestly, whether you're a German director stepping off a plane to try and conquer the Australian car market, or just an everyday Aussie heading overseas for a holiday, the very first hurdle you hit when you land is exactly the same: getting your phone connected. You definitely don't want to be caught at the airport paying extortionate international roaming fees just to send a quick email to the board. That's where the sponsor of today's video, Saily, comes in. If you haven't heard of Saily, it's an eSIM app. An eSIM is basically a digital SIM card that lets you connect to local internet networks around the world without having to mess around with tiny plastic trays or visit physical shops. Before you even head to the airport, you just download the Saily app, search for your destination, like Germany, and pick a data plan. When you go to checkout, enter my promo code INFINITELTD to get an exclusive 15% discount. You get it all set up before your flight and you're instantly good to go. The absolute best part is what happens when you arrive. Because you set it up early, your data plan is already active the moment the plane hits the tarmac. Before you even stand up to grab your carry-on, you can text your family to say you landed safely, book a corporate Uber from the terminal, and fire up Google Maps to navigate straight to your destination, whether that's a beach resort or a brand new Opel showroom. The convenience is unmatched. Once the Saily eSIM is installed on your phone, there's no need to install a new one for each country you visit. I've used plenty of other eSIM apps before, but Saily personally stands out to me because of their expanded region packages and incredibly competitive pricing. They offer affordable data plans in over 200 destinations worldwide, so whether you need a single country or a massive regional plan for a multi-stop trip, you can travel virtually anywhere and completely avoid those unexpected roaming charges. Get an exclusive 15% discount on your Saily data plans by using code INFINITELTD at checkout. Download the Saily app or go to saily.com/INFINITELTD to get connected today. While Europe and the United States were still shivering in the shadow of the global financial crisis, Australia was throwing a party. The mining boom was in full swing. Australia was digging iron ore and coal out of the Pilbara and shipping it to China faster than we could count the money. This resulted in the Australian dollar suddenly trading at parity with the US dollar. For a brief moment, we were the rich kids of the global economy. For international importers, the math was seductive. If you could build a car in Europe, paying for the labor and steel in a depressed euro, and then sell it in Australia for inflated mining boom Aussie dollars, you were effectively printing money. You are arbitraging the global economy. This currency hallucination blinded the Opel brass to the reality on the ground. They looked at the spreadsheets and saw a wealthy, English-speaking population that was obsessed with European luxury. They saw Audi, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz posting double-digit growth and the Volkswagen Golf becoming the uniform of the upwardly mobile suburbanite in Sydney and Melbourne. They thought, hey, we're German, we have engineering, therefore they will buy from us. But they missed the context. They missed the fact that the Australian car market is a shark tank. It has 60 automotive brands fighting for a market of just 1 million annual sales. That's more brands per capita than the United States, the UK, or arguably anywhere else on Earth. It's a graveyard for the unprepared. This was the market Opel was trying to dive into, wearing a suit made of money and carrying a map that was 20 years out of date. Their plan was to position themselves as accessible German. They wanted to be the bridge between the reliable but boring Japanese cars like Toyota and the expensive German luxury cars like Audi. They called it semi-premium, which sounds like a clever niche, but on the streets of Parramatta or Dandenong, semi-premium just means overpriced. The tragedy of Opel is that the cars themselves weren't actually bad. The Opel Astra, the Corsa, and the Insignia were competent, well-engineered European vehicles. But Opel had a problem that no amount of engineering could fix. We already knew these cars. For 2 decades, General Motors had been playing a game of badge engineering where they took Opel vehicles, shipped them to Australia, and slapped Holden badges on them. The TS Holden Astra, which sold hundreds of thousands of units in the early 2000s, was an Opel Astra. The XC Holden Barina, the car of choice for university students and rental fleets, was an Opel Corsa. These cars were deeply ingrained in the Australian psyche, but not as luxury items. They were the cars you bought because they were good value. They were reliable, ubiquitous, and very much unpretentious. So, when Opel arrived in 2012, puffing out their chest and claiming to be a prestigious new challenger, the Australian public suffered a collective case of whiplash. People walked into these shiny new showrooms, looked at the new Opel Corsa, and immediately recognized the silhouette of the cheap Holden Barina they had traded in 5 years ago. Opel was trying to sell Australians their own history back to them, but with a 20% markup. They were trying to convince them that the car we associated with P-plates and Macca's drive-thrus was actually a sophisticated European thoroughbred. It was the automotive equivalent of someone trying to sell you a Bunnings sausage sizzle for $25, calling it artisanal tube meat on brioche. Australians have a very specific radar for this kind of thing. We call it mutton dressed as lamb. And nothing triggers the Australian cynicism reflex faster than a brand trying to act better than its station. The marketing campaign didn't go any better. To launch a new brand in Australia, you need to connect. You need to understand the humor, the landscape, and the vibe. Look at Mazda's Zoom Zoom or Toyota's Oh What a Feeling. Those feel incredibly local, something that Opel should have taken notes from, but Opel decided to go the other way. They leaned so hard into their Germanness that it became a caricature. They launched with the global slogan, Wir leben Autos. They didn't even translate it. There was no effort on their end to make the local market understand what that meant. They just plastered Wir leben Autos on billboards from the Gold Coast to Perth. It roughly means we live cars, if you're wondering.
We leben Autos, we live cars. It's got so much potential, and I think it really, for all employees, for all dealers, for all customers.
And it's a pretty good sentiment, but leaving it in German was seen as pretty arrogant. They were trying to draft off the success of Volkswagen's Das Auto, Audi's Vorsprung durch Technik, but those brands had earned the right to use their native tongue. People knew and respected them. Opel was a stranger shouting in a foreign language. It felt like they were lecturing the Australian market. The reaction was brutal. It looked cheap and it showed a lack of respect. They couldn't even be bothered to film a car on an Australian road. It was a fundamental failure to read the room. Australians love an underdog, but what they hate is a blow-in who thinks they're doing them a favor just by showing up. Meanwhile, the finance department was busy walking into a trap set by their own sister company. The pricing strategy for Opel was catastrophic. They priced the entry-level Astra at roughly $24,000 plus on-road costs. By the time you drove it away, you were looking at nearly $28,000. In 2012, this was suicide. The Japanese government was actively devaluing the yen to stimulate their exports, which meant Mazda and Toyota had a war chest to slash prices. You could walk into a Mazda dealer and get a Mazda 3, a reliable, fun-to-drive car, for $19,990 drive away. So Opel was asking Australians to pay an $8,000 premium for a car that had zero brand recognition and a smaller dealer network. But the real killer was Holden. At the exact same time Opel was launching, Holden was selling the locally manufactured Cruise. The Holden Cruise was built on the exact same Delta II platform as the Opel Astra. It had similar engines and was roughly the same size, but because Holden built locally and had massive volume, they could sell it for thousands less. General Motors was effectively cannibalizing its own sales. A customer would walk into an Opel dealer, look at the sticker price, and then walk across the road to the Holden dealer. They would see a car that looked the same, felt the same, and did the same job, but was cheaper and came with the recognized and reliable Holden badge. Why would you buy the expensive, orphaned German version when you could buy the cheap, locally supported Aussie version? It was a question Opel just couldn't answer. Opel had projected selling 15,000 cars in their first 3 years. In their first 6 months, they shifted fewer than 1,000. The dealerships were empty. Sales staff were standing around polishing cars that nobody wanted to test drive. The inventory was piling up in holding yards, gathering dust and depreciating by the minute. We tend to think of corporations as faceless entities, but Opel Australia was composed of real human beings, of course. Australian family businesses and veterans of the industry who knew the game, yet still got played. Opel executives, led by Managing Director Bill Mott, looked these men and women in the eye and promised a long-term commitment, laying out a multi-year roadmap filled with SUVs, convertibles, and electrics. They convinced these dealers that Opel was the future of General Motors in Australia. Based on that handshake, these dealers invested millions, signed long-term leases, and built dedicated showrooms to meet Opel's strict European standards. They bought the furniture, hired the mechanics, and crucially, they bought the cars. Then came Friday, August 2nd, 2013. The dealers were summoned to a mandatory conference call. Most assumed it was just a strategy meeting. Opel is ceasing operations in Australia, effective immediately. The decision makers in Germany had looked at the spreadsheet, seen the red ink, and decided to amputate the limb. The dealers were left standing in their expensive, tiled showrooms, surrounded by cars that had just become toxic assets. They were forced to hold fire sales, slashing up to $15,000 off the sticker price just to clear the decks. They lost millions, fired staff, and launched a massive lawsuit against GM. It was a brutal, cold-blooded business decision that torched 60 years of trust in a single afternoon. Then there were the 1,530 people who actually bought the pitch. 1,530 Australians who watched the ads, went to the showroom, and put down their hard-earned cash for a premium German Opel. Overnight, the resale value of their cars dropped through the floor. A car is the second biggest investment most people make, and Opel had just set fire to 40% of that investment's value in a single afternoon. If you tried to trade in an Opel Astra in late 2013, car yards would literally laugh at you. Sorry mate, we don't take those. General Motors agreed to honor the warranties through Holden dealerships, but the reality was a nightmare. You were taking your special European car to a Holden dealer who viewed it as a nuisance. The mechanics hated working on them because they were different from the Commodores and Cruisers they saw every day. Parts had to be shipped from Germany, meaning simple repairs could take weeks. But the story has one final twisted chapter. A chapter that proves just how little General Motors understood the Australian market. You'd think, after losing millions and burning their reputation to the ground in 2013, that GM would keep the Opel brand as far away from Australia as possible. But no, Opel came back. In 2017, Holden shut down its factory in Elizabeth, ending the era of the Australian-made car.
Today we're announcing that Holden will cease manufacturing in Australia by the end of 2017.
But that didn't mean they would stop selling cars, particularly the legendary Holden Commodore. So Holden needed a car to stick the Commodore badge on, and in a move that reeked of desperation, they went back to Opel. They took the Opel Insignia, the exact same car that had failed so miserably in 2013, and they stuck a Holden badge on it. They called it the ZB Commodore. The public reaction was brutal. it was hate at first sight. Sales collapsed immediately, and the ZB Commodore went down as a disaster of historic proportions. It was the definition of a car that nobody asked for, answering a question that simply didn't exist. The failure of the ZB Commodore all but confirmed the end for the entire Holden brand. In 2020, General Motors announced they were retiring the Holden brand forever, and so we reached the ultimate irony.
Locally, tried everything to keep Holden going until it was evident.
Opel didn't just fail in Australia, their toxic touch was so potent that it helped kill off Australia's most beloved brand from beyond the grave. But what do you think? Did you fall for the German engineering pitch in 2012? Did you own one of the Orphan Astras? Or maybe you were one of the dealers who got that Friday afternoon call. Let us know all of your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.